What happens to a city when the soul gets priced out? In a Manhattan now gleaming with glass towers, curated cafes, and streets safer than ever, there's one place that still whispers the old language of the city, Hell's Kitchen. It was never polished, never polite, but it was real. A neighborhood where dock workers and mobsters lived door to door, where Broadway actors shared sidewalks with gangsters, and where fire escapes held more stories than social media ever could. Today we trace the rise, the fight, and the slow fade of a neighborhood that once defined working-class Manhattan. This is the story of Hell's Kitchen, and maybe the last real piece of New York. Long before it became a trendy stop on real estate brochures, or was rebranded with the sanitized name of Clinton, Hell's Kitchen was a crucible of survival. Stretching roughly from 34th to 59th Street, west of 8th Avenue, it began as a landing point for immigrants, mostly Irish and later Italian, who stepped off the boats at the Hudson River piers and found themselves in one of Manhattan's most unforgiving neighborhoods. In the late 19th century, the area was defined by tenement buildings packed with families, little sunlight, and the ever-present smell of coal, sweat, and desperation. Work was brutal but plentiful. Dock work, slaughterhouses, and factories. These were jobs that demanded muscle, not resumes. It was a blue-collar world, and that created a certain code, loyalty, toughness, and resilience. You didn't thrive here unless you could fight, and many did. The neighborhood's reputation for violence wasn't just folklore, it was street law. Gang activity exploded in the early 1900s, with turf wars breaking out between Irish and Italian crews, and later Puerto Rican groups as demographics shifted. Crime wasn't a shadowy undercurrent. It was a daily reality. But it was also a place of community, where kids played stickball in the streets, and fire hydrants turned into fountains during summer heat waves. Hell's Kitchen lived up to its name. It wasn't just gritty, it was elemental. It burned with energy, defiance, and a kind of chaotic pride. This was the backdrop that inspired films like West Side Story, which dramatized the ethnic tension and the sense of territorial loyalty that defined the area. And though the musical softened the edges, the truth was rawer, harsher, and more permanent. What began as a slum became a sanctuary for the forgotten. Hell's Kitchen didn't ask who you were, it asked how hard you were willing to fight to stay. And that identity would shape everything that came after. As the 20th century unfolded, Hell's Kitchen became a neighborhood defined not just by poverty, but by power. Raw, violent, street-forged power. It was here that mob empires tested their grip on New York's West Side. And it was here that a reputation was born, of a place where everyone knew someone who could break your legs or save your life. The Irish were the first to dominate. For decades, Hell's Kitchen was a stronghold of Irish-American identity, and with it came a network of protection, tradition, and crime. By the 1970s and 80s, this neighborhood was the domain of the Westies, an infamous Irish-American gang feared for their brutality and tight-knit code. Led by men like Mickey Spillane and later Jimmy Coonan, they controlled everything from gambling to loan sharking to union jobs on the docks and construction sites. Violence was business, murder was negotiation. As construction overtook shipping as the city's engine, the neighborhood drew the attention of the Italian mafia. Deals were struck behind closed doors. Alliances were made in blood. The Westies partnered with the Gambino family, most notably under John Gotti's shadow. When Spillane was pushed aside and ultimately murdered, the message was clear. Hell's Kitchen belonged to the ones who could control it with force. But while the headlines focused on killings and crime families, life in Hell's Kitchen still had rhythm. People went to church. Families watched out for each other. Bars buzzed with laughter. Beneath the surface, it wasn't just a neighborhood of gangsters. It was a community of survivors. And yet, the danger was very real. Walk the streets in the wrong shoes, speak to the wrong person, and you could disappear. The myth of Hell's Kitchen wasn't fiction. It was lived experience. And its legend grew not from movies or books, but from the blood in the gutters and the silence of neighbors who knew better than to talk. By the early 1990s, the winds in Hell's Kitchen had begun to shift. What was once a stronghold of blue-collar survivalism and ethnic grit started to feel the pressure of development. The violence didn't vanish overnight, but its roots began to rot as the money moved in. Slowly, street by street, The neighborhood that once terrified outsiders started to appeal to them. Real estate developers rebranded it as Clinton, a name meant to distance the area from its hellish moniker. Mid-level professionals moved into brownstones once shared by generations of immigrant families. Bars that once served whiskey to dock workers now offered cocktails to investment bankers. The change wasn't gradual, it was surgical. The 9th Avenue L, which had once blackened the air with soot and smoke, had already been dismantled in the 1940s, clearing the path quite literally for transformation. Theaters from nearby Broadway crept westward, spilling artistic influence into the area. Actors and writers, attracted by cheap rents and proximity to studios, brought a new flavor of cool. By the mid-70s, restaurants began to pop up first, modest, then upscale, turning 9th Avenue into a corridor of culinary reinvention. West 46th Street became known as Restaurant Row, catering to pre-show diners and tourists. The smell of garlic and grilled salmon slowly replaced that of wet concrete and cigarette ash. Some welcomed the change. Others mourned it. The corner dive bars, where fathers once drank after long shifts, were being replaced by franchises. Family-owned stores folded under rent hikes. Manganero's Grosseria Italiana, run by the same family since the late 1800s, held out, but it was one of the last. By the time the Holland Bar closed its doors in the early 2000s, the writing was on the wall. Hell's Kitchen was being sanitized. The grit that made it mythic was swept up in favor of glass towers and yoga studios. And with each new building, the neighborhood that once raised the toughest kids in New York faded a little more into memory. For decades, Hell's Kitchen wasn't just a place, it was a character, cast over and over again in New York's most iconic stories. Its streets were a film set, a backdrop, a battleground. From West Side Story to Taxi Driver, from The Godfather Part 2 to Bringing Out the Dead, the neighborhood was immortalized as a place of tension, danger, and a strange kind of romance. That reputation was earned. This was where Vito Corleone sharpened his instincts as a young immigrant, where gang wars turned tenement blocks into war zones. But it was also where artists, actors, and writers found inspiration in the chaos. The Actors Studio on West 44th Street attracted method performers and avant-garde creatives drawn to the area's raw authenticity. Anthony Bourdain once said he believed Hell's Kitchen would be the last neighborhood to fall, that its grit was too deep to be scrubbed clean. Pop culture clung to the idea. Even as the area gentrified, shows like Daredevil revived the myth, casting Hell's Kitchen as a place still ruled by violence and shadowy powers. In truth, though, the real Hell's Kitchen, the one of dive bars, alleyway deals, and rooftop whispers, was evaporating under the neon glow of chain stores and polished condos. And yet, the myth persists, because it tells a deeper truth. Hell's Kitchen wasn't perfect, far from it, but it represented a version of New York that felt unfiltered. It was where toughness meant something, where working people lived close to the city's beating heart, not on the margins. Today, you can still walk those streets. The names are the same, but the sounds, the smells, the stories, they're fading. And maybe that's why the image of Hell's Kitchen in our collective memory remains so sharp, because what we remember wasn't just a place, it was a feeling of danger, yes, but also of possibility, of authenticity, of life lived without a filter. As the 21st century moves forward, Hell's Kitchen stands as a shadow of its former self, a neighborhood still marked on the map, but increasingly unrecognizable to those who grew up there. Rents have soared, independent shops have vanished, families who had lived there for generations were priced out, their homes flipped into sleek condos or rented out as Airbnbs. Still, some fragments remain not in the real estate, but in the people and memories that refuse to be erased. Walk far enough west, toward the Hudson River, and you'll still find remnants of the old docks, bars that survived by owning their walls, and diners that still serve coffee the same way they did 40 years ago. You'll still see old-timers sitting on stoops, trading stories no app can archive. But they're outnumbered now. The stories they tell of Irish gangsters, Puerto Rican turf wars, actors rehearsing lines at 3 a.m., or drag queens ducking into back doors are increasingly treated like fairy tales. The Holland Bar is gone, Manganero's is gone, And with every old business that closes, the culture it carried disappears. Gentrification didn't just change the buildings, it changed the soul of the neighborhood. What once made Hell's Kitchen iconic wasn't its violence, but its texture. Layers of lives, languages, and loyalties colliding within a few square blocks. It was the New York of hard truths and honest survival. A place that smelled of sweat, garlic, spilled whiskey, and fresh paint. A place where you didn't just live, you endured, you hustled, you mattered. Now, the name remains, but the hell has been cleaned out of Hell's Kitchen, and what's left behind might be safer, sleeker, more efficient, but it's quieter. The music, the madness, the character, it's all been turned down. And if anything of the old neighborhood is to survive, it won't be in the storefronts, it will be in the stories we still bother to tell. So now we ask you, did you ever walk through Hell's Kitchen when the air was thick with cigarette smoke and stories? Did you ever sit at a bar that's no longer there? Or watch a fight break out over nothing on 9th Avenue? Maybe you just remember the feeling, that edge, that heat, that unspoken understanding that this was still real New York. Because today, Hell's Kitchen has changed. The names of the streets haven't, but the rhythm, the grit, the life, much of it, has been swept away. In its place stand towers of glass, artisanal coffee shops, and chain stores polished to perfection. Safer, yes, but also sanitized. And maybe that's the trade we made without knowing. We cleaned up the mess, but somewhere along the way, we lost the music. The voices shouting from windows, the clatter of old diner plates, the heavy footsteps of dock workers heading home, all replaced by a quieter, shinier city. So, we want to hear from you. Do you remember Hell's Kitchen before the change? Or maybe you live there now and only know it through echoes? Drop your memories, your stories, even just a name of a place that meant something to you, because that's the only way the real Hell's Kitchen survives. They took the hell out of it, sure, but maybe, just maybe, it's still burning in someone's memory. Maybe yours.